Who is Vulkan? Vulkan was one of the Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind to lead his Great Crusade and reunite the scattered peoples of humanity. His Space Marine Legion was renamed the Salamanders in his honor. As with all the Primarchs, Vulkan inherited an aspect of his father. However, from him this was the unique ability of being a perpetual, making him essentially immortal. Vulkan was able to regenerate fully from an injury, including a death that would vaporize him completely. This ability was unknown to him until the Horus Heresy, and during the Great Crusade, he gained a reputation for his empathy towards average humans, as well as his craftsmanship abilities. When the Primarchs were scattered from the Emperor's laboratory, Vulkan arrived on the planet Nocturne during the time of trial as an infant, and was soon taken in by the blacksmith Nebel. Nebel raised Vulkan in naming him after the first king of the Salamanders, and the young Primarch considered him his father. The people of his hometown were astounded by this child, for within the span of 3 years, he was stronger and bigger than any human in his town. In addition to his massive physical size, he was the quickest-minded and the greatest blacksmith anyone knew of. Indeed, it was not long before Vulkan himself was teaching forging techniques to the people that had not yet been discovered. The people of Nocturne were frequently raided by the Dark Eldar. They were so used to this common occurrence that each person in town had developed their own hiding place to avoid capture. When the Dark Eldar raided again in Vulkan's 4th year on Nocturne, the Primarch refused to hide and instead stood out in the center of the settlement, his 2 smithing hammers crossed over his shoulders. The people of Vulkan's town were so inspired by his example that they joined him and prepared to defend their town. With the Primarch leading the defense, the people of the town decisively defeated the Dark Eldar. Vulkan alone killed 100 Eldar that day. Within weeks, the leaders of the 7 largest towns in the Nocturne had traveled to meet Vulkan, and they soon swore never again to hide from the raiders. In celebration of the Primarch's victory over the Eldar raiders, a tournament was decided to be held. Unexpectedly, a stranger arrived in the middle of the festivities. Of pale complexion and wearing outlandish clothing, the stranger asked only to be allowed to compete. When he announced that he could best anyone in the town, the people laughed at this outlander. Who could possibly beat Vulkan in any feat of intellect, strength, craftsmanship, or endurance? Nonetheless, Vulkan and the stranger wagered that whoever lost the tournament would forever serve the victor. Lasting 8 days, the contest included many tests of strength and endurance, such as the anvil lift, in which the 2 held anvils above their heads for half a day before contest was called a tie. The number of contests is unimportant. However, by the end of day 8, Vulkan and the stranger were tied. In the final event, both contestants were given 24 hours to construct a weapon, before using said weapon to hunt down and slay the largest salamander they could find. Climbing a high mountain, the 2 went out to find a drake. Vulkan quickly found and killed a very large fire drake. However, on his way back, the mountain he was standing on, which coincidentally was a volcano, erupted, casting Vulkan over a cliff. Hanging on for dear life over the precipice, Vulkan was determined to hang on to his massive salamander. Thus, he found himself hanging by one hand from a cliff and the other hand clutching the tail of his drake. Hanging there for hours, Vulkan's strength eventually ebbed away until he knew he must decide between the drake or his life. At this moment, however, the stranger arrived carrying his own drake. Even from the edge of the cliff, the Primarch could tell that the outlander's drake was indeed bigger. Seeing Vulkan in distress, the stranger acted quickly, tossing his drake into a lava flow that separated them and using it as a bridge to cross to the Primarch. After hoisting Vulkan out of his mortal predicament, the stranger walked with him back to the town, leaving his own drake to burn in the river of molten rock. Though the outlander's drake had been superior in size, he had thrown it away to save Vulkan, and when he returned to town, the Primarch empty-handed, Vulkan was declared the victor. To the amazement of his people, however, Vulkan kneeled before the stranger and said that any man who would value life over pride was worthy of his service. At this moment, the Outlander cast off his illusionary disguise and revealed himself to be the Holy Emperor of humanity. Thus, it was that the Primarch, Vulkan, and his Emperor were united. It is believed that at first Vulkan did not become unified with his own legion for some years after his rediscovery, instead staying alongside the Emperor under his tutelage and fighting by his side. When Vulkan was eventually reunited with his legion, it was at the head of the fleet of 3,000 new recruits, which saved his forces from a massive orc horde. Eventually, it was decided that Vulkan's legion of Space Marines would henceforth be known as the Salamanders, in honor of the beast that had united him with his father. The Primarch continued to serve loyally throughout the Great Crusade. At some point during the Great Crusade, Vulkan and his legion participated in the reconquest of a world designated 1546. Together with the Night Lords led by their Primarch, Conrad Kurtz, and Mechanicum Titan Legion, Legio Ignis, and several Imperial Army regiments. During this campaign, Vulkan became enraged by how Kurtz and his legion waged war after he found out that the Night Lords had killed the inhabitants of a whole city in order to seed their fear amongst the population. This confrontation between Vulkan and Kurtz resulted in a brief but fierce argument between the two Primarchs. After conclusion of this campaign, Vulkan reported Kurtz's behavior and actions to War Master Horus and Primarch Dorn of the Imperial Fists. However, during the battle against the Caratans, ruling Eldar Coven, Vulkan flew into a rage when the Remembrancer Seraph was killed, and killed the surrendering Eldar child. This incident would haunt the Primarch deeply. On the world of 1544, Vulkan and his army came into contact with the tribes of primitive humans living alongside an Exodite Eldar. Surprisingly, the humans did not welcome the Imperial invaders. Vulkan was guided by a mysterious Remembrancer, later discovered to be a psychic projection of the Emperor, to a webway portal. After a vicious battle, the portal, Vulkan came across human tribals preparing to sacrifice a Dark Eldar woman. The humans had learned to fear the Dark Eldar raiders and sought to sacrifice her to ward off their return now that the Exodites had been defeated. Moreover, Vulkan realized that the Dark Eldar woman was from the raiding parties that terrorized Nocturne in his youth, and these humans were descendants of the Nocturne captives liberated by the Eldar. Vulkan realized the Emperor had guided him here and understand that these humans would never accept the Imperium over their Eldar liberators and ordered the planet to be cleansed. He sought to erase any trace of human-Xenos coexistence. Later, when Vulkan gave his protest to Horus, he sensed a great darkness within him. This caused Vulkan to neglect giving Horus the hammer Dawnbringer. Vulkan was present alongside Ferrus Manus and Corax at the Isstvan V drop site massacre. During the battle, the majority of the Salamander's Legion were killed by nuclear missiles fired from the Iron Warriors. Due to his perpetual regeneration abilities, Vulkan survived the explosion, but found himself surrounded by the hundreds of warriors from the Iron Warriors and Night Lords. Fighting to what he thought was his death, Vulkan was stabbed, shot, and bludgeoned in unconsciousness. Seeing a chance to torment his brother, Conrad Kurtz took Vulkan prisoner. The Primarch of the Night Lords spent the next several months trying to both break Vulkan's spirit and try to kill him. Kurtz personally cut Vulkan's head off, ripped out his throat with a fork, stabbed him through the chest, and tore him limb from limb. Separately, he had Vulkan eviscerated. Shot with hundreds of bolters at close range, left in the venting shaft of the starship's engine, and even thrown in empty space completely naked. Each time Vulkan died, his body would regenerate completely, leaving Kurtz furious. Eventually, frustrated and bored with his inability to kill Vulkan, Kurtz decided to get Vulkan to admit that he was no less a monster than himself. Kurtz had several Davinite priests ensnare Vulkan's mind and run him through trial after trial, ensuring he failed each time and innocents died. When Vulkan would not break, Kurtz decided to end things in a duel. He made Vulkan navigate a maze designed by Perturbo. At the center of each lay Dawnbringer, Vulkan's personal hammer, as well as the corpses of several of his comrades. When Vulkan retrieved his hammer and managed to overpower Kurtz and activated a teleporter built into the head of the hammer, Vulkan was transported across the galaxy into an upper atmosphere of the Magarage and burnt up during re-entry, confident he would wake up in the care of the Ultramarines. His charred body was later discovered discovered by the Ultramarines, who first were unable to identify the corpse as anything more than a grotesque statue. All living matter having burned up on re-entry, over a series of days, Vulkan's body began to regenerate, eventually returning to life and shocking the Ultramarines he had been entrusted to. Realizing who it was, the apothecaries summoned their Primarch, Guilliman, who was at first furious that no one could give him any answers as to how or why Vulkan had suddenly fallen from the skies. To Guilliman's horror, he found that Vulkan was broken mentally, violent and incoherent, attacking anything and everything he could. Unknown to anyone, a bond of sorts had formed between Kurtz and Vulkan, the latter being able to sense when the Night Haunter was nearby. Kurtz was indeed on Mackridge, having been trapped aboard the Invincible Reason, but eventually breaking out of the Dark Angel's flagship and stealing a drop pod to the surface. Vulkan broke free of his bonds and plagued Guilliman's private armory before setting off to hunt Kurtz. The two fought across an entire city, Vulkan finally realizing his regenerative abilities and using them to his advantage. By focusing his will, he could regenerate much quicker. At one point, Kurtz shot Vulkan's head off, causing the Primarch to fall from a cliff. Vulkan was back alive before he hit the ground. The rolling duel was eventually stopped by the perpetual John Grammaticus, who had been charged by the Cabal to permanently kill Vulkan with the Fulgurite, a petrified bolt of Emperor's own psychic abilities. The Cabal had ordered Grammaticus to give the Fulgurite to Kurtz, as only a Primarch could kill another Primarch. But before he could complete his mission, Eldrad Utherin appeared to Grammaticus, convincing him that if he himself used the Fulgurite to kill Vulkan, he would give up his perpetual nature forever, but in exchange completely restore Vulkan's mind. The presences and abilities of another Primarch in the Emperor's armies would tip the balance against Horus. Grammaticus stabbed Vulkan through the heart, killing both of them in a psychic explosion. Grammaticus regenerated as he always did, but was aware that this would be his last life. Vulkan never recovered. Later, Vulkan's corpse was reclaimed by the Primarchs Guilliman, L. Johnson, and Sanguinius. Vulkan was placed in a stasis capsule handcrafted by Guilliman himself, with the words Unbound Flame carved into the side. The few remaining salamanders who had made it to Mackridge were allowed to stand guard over their fallen Primarch until such time as he could be returned to Nocturne. During their vigil, the salamanders thought they heard a heartbeat coming from the casket, but dismissed it. Convinced he could be resurrected, an expedition back to Nocturne led by Artellus Numian eventually was able to bring Vulkan's body back to Nocturne, and with Numian as the final sacrifice, Vulkan was restored from the unbound flame at Mount Deathfire. Upon his resurrection, Vulkan was in a condition similar to a fugue state and remembered little. He found himself in the depths of Mount Deathfire, conversing with an old man calling himself Deathfire personified. The man urged Vulkan to travel to Terra and lead the Primarch to two items that he had no memory of forging, the Thunder Hammer Erdracule and the Talisman of Seven Hammers. When Vulkan awoke, he was at the steps of Mount Deathfire and discovered by three of his legionnaires, Antuk Abademi, Barak Zetos, and Aegon Cargo. Vulkan ordered the three to return in 3 days and forbade them to speak to anyone else that the Primarch had returned to Nocturne. When the three returned, now dubbed Vulkan's Draxword, the Primarch used his talisman to open a webway portal deep below Nocturne. What followed next was an arduous journey through multiple webway tunnels and exits to reach Terra. Vulkan and his Draxword found themselves in a satellite realm of Kumarath, battling Dark Eldar. They next found themselves at the fleet of Shadrach Medusan, still engaged in a guerrilla war against Horus. Vulkan found Medusan's fleet in the midst of upheaval, and the cult of the Korgon claiming that it had resurrected Ferrus Manus, Upon meeting the supposed reborn Ferris, Vulkan discovered it to be little more than a mechanical puppet with one of Ferris's metallic arms attached. Saddened that his brother would be shamed so, Vulkan shattered the puppet with his hammer. Vulkan refused to take part in Medusan's war during the Battle of Aragnachain, left for Caldra. On Caldra, Vulkan was greeted by Eldar, who guided him to a new webway portal in the orders of Eldred Ulthron. Inside the webway, once more, Vulkan and the Draxword ventured upon Kalistar, long since abandoned since the war within the webway. On Kalistar, the companions were beset by demons, and Vulkan became engaged in a battle with the great unclean known as Algabar. Using the Talisman of Seven Hammers, Vulkan was able to not only slay the demon, but give it a true death. Still beset by demonic hordes, the companions were saved by Eldred, revealing himself as the Old Man of Mount Deathfire. Revealing that way until the Imperial dungeon had been sealed by the Emperor, Eldred opened up a new portal that took Vulkan and his warriors to the front of the Imperial Palace. Vulkan was reunited with the visibly relieved Rogel Dorn, but promptly led by Custodes to the Golden Throne to meet with the Emperor himself. The Emperor, now trapped on the throne, revealed that he had not only been expecting Vulkan, but had been guiding him in this entire journey, and had been the force that compelled him to construct the Eudracule and the Talisman of Seven Hammers. The Emperor told Vulkan that the Primarch's purpose had always been intended for this moment, for he was designed to construct the talisman and oversee its true purpose. The Emperor revealed that the talisman was the weapon of unprecedented power, a dead man's switch that would consume all of Terra should Horus succeed in the coming struggle. It would be Vulkan's duty to press the switch that would destroy Terra, but deny the world to the powers of chaos. Vulkan was horrified by the prospect, but the Emperor told him that he must be the one to oversee the device, for the Primarch has always been the most hesitant to use the weapons he forges. With that, Vulkan installed the talisman into the Golden Throne and took up position by the Eternity Gate. Keeping his existence a secret to save for a select few during the siege of Terra, Vulkan next saw action when Magnus in the Red and a group of his 1,000 sons infiltrated the Imperial dungeon to kill the Emperor. Vulkan blocked a lethal blow by Magnus' staff that had been intended for the Emperor's form upon the Golden Throne, but quickly backed down and alongside their father bid Magnus to return to the Imperial's fold. Vulkan became disheartened that when Magnus refused the offer to return to the Loyalists after the Emperor told him that he would have to purge his legion due to its rampant mutations. Vulkan himself admitted he would have made the same choice as Magnus, but nonetheless, again, defended the Emperor against the Crimson King's assault. Vulkan and Magnus then engaged in a furious duel, but was saved from the decapitating blow thanks to the sacrifice of Ingen Cargo. Horrified by his son's death and taking up his Thunderhammer, Vulkan wielded twin hammers to seemingly beat Magnus to submission. However, before a visibly despairing Vulkan could deliver the final blow, Magnus fully gave himself over to the powers of chaos and vanished from the throne room. With Magnus now inside the Imperial webway and enacting a psychic ritual to sap the Emperor's remaining strength, Vulkan, dispatched by Malcador to put an end to his brother as the Eternity Gate itself was besieged. As he moved through the webway, he ignored Magnus's lies and goadings along the way. After journeying to the impossible city to the webway, Vulkan finally came before Magnus. Again, ignoring his brother's manipulations, including a vision of the burning of Prospero, the two came to blows. Initially in their battle, Vulkan seemed to hit nothing but smoke, and it became apparent he was swinging his hammer at smoke. The real Magnus was behind a psychic barrier, steeped with his own ritual to weaken the Emperor. Vulkan took advantage of this by smashing through the already stressed Magnus's barrier, forcing the Crimson King to try and kill Vulkan directly so that he may be allowed to complete his work. Magnus tried every method conceivable to kill his brother. He beheaded him with his khopesh, suffocated him by turning his lungs to amber, and drained him of his blood, and immolated him with psychic fire. However, nothing worked, and each time the perpetual Vulkan would regenerate and continue to hammer away at Magnus. And attrition took hold, and Magnus grew increasingly desperate. He centered Vulkan's mind as the noble he had once been, attempting to explain his actions. Vulkan had none of it, however, scolding Magnus for his arrogant and reckless use of sorcery that had turned him into a slave to chaos. In the webway, Vulkan stood above Magnus, ready to deliver the killing blow. However, he hesitated despite the Emperor's own voice ordering the Salamander's Primarch to kill his brother. Magnus used this moment to unleash a spell that he had been working on, undoing Vulkan at a genetic level in a desperate bid to finally kill him. As Vulkan crumbled apart, he nonetheless was able to swing his hammer, smashing off Magnus's head with the Urdracule and banishing him into the warp. Later, Vulkan's regenerating form was seen slowly making its way back to the palace's webway with his weapon in hand. It is claimed Vulkan was one of the Primarchs to oppose the Codex Astartes. This, however, would not be for a lack of courage or loyalty, but due to crippling losses sustained on Isstvan V, where his legion was cut down in size but to a few. During the Great Scoring, he became furious at the tales of the horrors visited upon Terra's population by the Emperor's children, and attempted to find and kill Fabius Bile. Sometime later, Vulkan chose to leave the Salamanders, claiming that, like Space Wolves, he would return in end times, the same as the Space Wolf Primarch Leman Russ. That was the last that anyone saw of Vulkan for the next 1,500 years. $1,500 later, during the War of the Beast, Vulkan reappeared, single-handedly defending the imperial world of Caldura from a massive orc invasion. Though he died many times against the Greenskins, he would regenerate and appear again at the forefront. Vulkan's one-man war on Caldura was unveiled by the Inquisition, and Lord Commander of the Imperium Courland led an expedition to the world to recruit him for a counteroffensive against the mighty war boss known as the Beast. Vulkan was eventually discovered by the expedition, but refused to lead it until Caldura was saved, citing a vow long ago that he made to the world to never again let it fall to flame. With the aid of the Imperial forces, Vulkan was able to save Caldera from the destruction by destroying the attack moon construction generator. After saving Caldera, Vulkan returned to Terra with Courland. He took command of a frantic Imperium, scolding the High Lords for their squabblings and inefficiency, but stating he would not purge them for the sake of unity. He then proclaimed that he would lead the might of the Imperium to Ulanor, the homeworld of the Beast. Vulkan made clear that his return was temporary, for he was destined to reappear for another war in another time. Vulkan officially led the subsequent crusade on Ulanor to find and slay the Beast once and for all, but in truth left most of the details to Courland, who he gave his full support to. Instead, Vulkan tinkered with the Doom Tremor and remained isolated in his chambers aboard the Fist's Exemplar's battle barge, El Khazar Remembered. Though this discouraged many at first, Vulkan leapt into the fray of battle directly when the Imperial forces reached the capital, which was the city of Ulanor, Gorkragord. Vulkan eventually led the final charge into the Beast's massive temple, Garand, and confronted the war boss directly. Realizing that Vulkan had always intended to fight the Beast alone, and knowing he could do little in the fight, Courland ordered an evacuation from the temple as the two giants clashed. The 10-meter-high war boss revealed he spoke perfect Imperial Gothic, gloating that humanity was on its knees, and he would be its end. Vulkan tackled the war boss, and they both fell into the temple Garand's power generator, where the Primarch became imbued with massive amounts of energies. rather than be consumed by the energies as so many other men had. Vulkan used his primal and savage essence to become one with it and launch one last attack. He slammed the doom tremor into the beast's face and detonated the generator, causing a chain reaction that shattered the temple garand and seemingly obliterating both of them.